Welcome back, everyone, to Reclamation, a beEmboldened initiative, where we focus on living out freedom from spiritual abuse. We have Dr. Robert Dahl back with us today for part 2 of our conversation on the overlap between physical health and mental health. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, it's not that you necessarily have to, but I would recommend it because we're picking up kind of in the middle of Dr. Rob's considerations for trauma survivors who have recognized the impact of good physical care on their healing process. So jumping in now, you'll still totally get stuff out of it, but I think it'll make more sense if you go back and listen to part 1 first. And Rob, I wanted to pick up actually where I don't remember if we actually said this at the end of the episode, or if you and I chatted for a minute after. I think it was after we chatted for a minute, but we were talking a little bit about wanting to make a recommendation for everyone not to worry about making all these changes at once because it just can be too overwhelming. So I wanted to pick up there before we jump into the impact of diet on mental health. Anything else you'd want to add for people on how to maybe think about these suggestions and how to begin to integrate them into their lives?
Sure. We talk about and actually remember that conversation. I'm not sure if we were recording it or not, but I think it was in the context of a patient that I had seen in the emergency department who he came in and things were kind of falling apart. And I said, this kind of casual conversation. Well, tell me. And he had just kind of quit everything cold turkey. He'd quit drugs and smoking, and he'd quit sugar, and I'm like, wow, that's why you're here, right? It's too much at once, right? I applaud the effort, but it sounds a little cliche, but it's a journey, it's a process, and the old Rome wasn't built in a day, and this kind of positive outcome that we're seeking, because I think that's what we're looking for. So everybody's focused on this outcome, where I want to have a healthy mind and a healthy body, and really what it is, it's a positive journey. It's not a destination, because unfortunately along the way, we will continue to age, and so your best efforts to stay healthy and to be the best you can will be thwarted by, the normal aging process, which is okay, because, my favorite patients are the ones that have, figured out how to, just have this graceful health, despite, there's cognitive decline that happens as part of, the aging process. And so, yes, just remembering that, small steps. We always talk about, SMART goals that are specific, they're measurable, they're achievable, they're reasonable, and they're timely. So, kind of using that little mnemonic is good, is to say, well, thinking about the small goal that you want to accomplish in the next 24 to 48 hours or in the next week. And focus on that one small goal. And then when you achieve that, give yourself some positive reinforcement for achieving that goal, and then figure out where you want to go next, right? Trying to do it all at once is not only overwhelming, but it's also kind of setting yourself up for failure. And we know that there's quite a bit of data that shows, for example, smoking cessation, right? So people oftentimes put on weight when they stop smoking. And so then they'll start trying to tackle both things at the same time. They're trying to tackle the weight gain, and they're trying to tackle, the smoking cessation and these cravings. And it's really, I've seen it done, and it's really poor advice to say, well, let's restrict you to a 1,200 calorie a day diet, right? And we talked about this a little bit last time, but everybody's kind of got a limited amount of willpower. And so if you're expanding all of your willpower to try to stop smoking, and then at the same time you're trying to maintain a 1,200 calorie diet, one of those two things is probably going to fail. So again, it's really about just kind of having these small, reasonable goals, accomplishing them one at a time. Keep a logbook, right? Sometimes it's easy to forget about the small goals that you've already accomplished, but keep that there so that you can revisit that and use that as kind of again, a reinforcement of the progress that you've made. We tend to make steps in mental and physical health in very small increments. And sometimes it's hard to, look at ourselves one day and go, oh, wow, I see a totally new person. So, having a record of that, to be able to go back and say, okay, well, I did these things. Wow, I didn't really realize how far I've come. So, and again, being kind to yourself. It's okay. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back is still 1 step forward,
Yeah.
right? So, a lot of it is, I think especially, in a lot of the trauma folks that I work with, they tend to be very self-critical, and they feel that any tiny little setback is tantamount to a complete and utter failure. And I don't think that's the case. I think that part of that is just learning to be kind to ourselves and learning to recognize the steps and the achievements that we've made, and keep those things in perspective when we have obstacles sometimes that are difficult to overcome, or just things that set us back a step or two.
Gosh, yeah, that is a great perspective. I love the idea of actually tracking, because I wholeheartedly agree, and I hear that so often from people. One of the fun things that I get to do that I really enjoy is, after I've known someone for an extended period of time, and inevitably they land somewhere where they feel like they're not really getting anywhere, I get to remind them of where they were when I met them. And they're always like, oh gosh, wow. Yeah, you're right. Like, I am not in the same place that I had been. It's always really encouraging to be able to, live that through with someone and be able to reflect back and remind them. But yes, being able to notate it for themselves, as well as, like you said, remembering how to reward yourself. And if anyone was watching this on the video version on YouTube, they'll be like, why did Naomi start smiling when he said that? Well, it's because I was thinking about how I like to reward myself with what I actually am trying not to do. And so we have to figure out, what is the actual reward system? Like, if I'm trying not to really eat sugar, because I have diabetes on both sides of my family, and I've had some, a little bit of concern myself. And so trying to just really be careful of that. The reward for having a good day of not really eating much sugar is not to have a bowl of ice cream. That's not the reward to have. So we have to figure out, what is the actual reward here that will make sense. So I was kind of smiling about that. But yes, these are excellent tips. And now that I'm talking about ice cream, not only do I want some, but why don't we go ahead and jump into diet? How does diet affect our mental health and how we're doing? What there can we maybe glean from you and start to put into effect moving forward?
Yeah, again, it's such a broad topic, but the first thing that comes that when I think of diet and mental health, the first thing that really kind of jumps out at me is inflammation. And you go, well, where does that go? So, our thoughts, who we are, kind of our mood, a lot of that just kind of, it depends on the electrical activity in our brain and this, neurochemical activity in our brain. When we have these things, we have all these little proteins floating around and neurotransmitters. I don't want to get too far into the science, and I certainly don't want to get too far into the science where some people think that I'm not talking about who we are individually, or, who God has created us to be. God created what He created, and just because, again, we know about nuclear fission or nuclear fusion, it doesn't mean that God didn't create the sun. It's just, part of how it is there. So I definitely don't want to preface what I'm saying about kind of the biological basis for mood as part of a system that God has designed, right? Just like He has designed lots of systems that, if we do things His way, those systems tend to work very much in harmony with His design, versus if we try to use systems in a way that they're not designed to be used, that they tend to get a little cluttered and they don't run as efficiently. And so in that process, thinking about, really two ways that things go on in the brain. One is electrical, and one is chemical. It's neurotransmitters. And there's all these hypotheses. We still really don't entirely understand how depression works. So, again, we talk about mood. The first thing that people think of when we talk about mood is depressed mood, usually, because that's the thing that's concerning. And we don't have a great 100% understanding. There's long been this kind of what we call a monoamine hypothesis of depression, where we say, okay, well, you've got a deficiency in serotonin, whether that's the way that serotonin binds or whether it's just too little or what goes on. And so we have all these drugs, psychotropic medications that we use to try to affect serotonin, right? And so the pharmacology is targeted at that. But the side of diet that addresses that is we go, well, how do we, for lack of a better term, ungunk the signals, right? How do we make it so that what's already there, so the neurotransmitters that are there, the electrical signals that are traveling, how do we make those things that are already there in the absence of pharmacology or even in the presence of augmentation with psychopharmacology, how do we make that whole system work better? And a lot of that, there's again, a lot of studies that show inflammation is one of those things that really kind of affects the, again, let's call it the integrity of our communication within our neural networks. And probably, again, the biggest culprit in all of that is sugar. And again, this is another thing that's really just not extremely well understood. I think probably the best, the best leading hypothesis is that, intake of sugar leads to, fatty acid synthesis and some of these other biochemical processes that go on. And anytime there's a process in the body, and I have these talks so often, I can't remember who I've told them to most recently, but the processes go on in the body are much like the processes, in an internal combustion engine. So if your car's running, one of the ways it's running, especially on a cold day, is you see some exhaust coming out of the tailpipe, right? So there are waste products that happen from combustion in your car engine, just as there are waste products that occur as, part of, the biochemical processes that go on in the body. And when we take in sugar, we kind of ramp up those biochemical processes. So we get, oxidation. That oxidation can lead to free radicals. All of this ultimately amounts to the body saying, how am I going to deal with this? Well, I need to kind of ramp up the immune system. And we get a release of these kind of pro-inflammatory markers called cytokines, and everything just kind of gets ramped up, and everybody's all, ginned up. When I say everybody, I mean kind of all of these biochemical processes. And what happens then is these processes that go on that talk about communication, deal with communication in our brain, don't function as well. And as kind of a prime example, I hear people often come in and they complain to me about brain fog. They'll say, "Oh my goodness, I just had this terrible brain fog." And again, this is something I see often in patients that have a history of trauma. They talk about this brain fog, being a barrier to addressing kind of and integrating what's going on. And that really makes sense because, again, when we talk about, not having to put a label of, PTSD on it, but just from this general process, we know that, there are higher levels of cortisol. There's this kind of greater release of catecholamines. All of this, again, becomes pro-inflammatory. And it makes sense that what they're describing is a real phenomena that, we can see that is going on. And so sugar, kind of circle back around to this point. If you've already got high levels of cortisol from any other processes, such as, stress, stressful work, stressful job, stress of, past trauma that, is kind of keeping you ramped up, then sugar adds fuel to the fire. And it causes this kind of, again, this mucking up of the signals to become even worse. And then we're at a point where we feel kind of like this balloon head, and you're like, I just can't quite get my thoughts together. So sugar is, all sugars are not created equal. I will preface with that. So I'm not necessarily saying that, you can't have an orange. It's just something we can, we'll definitely address here, different types of sugar. But I want to take a break so I can kind of allow you to interject here and kind of reflect on that piece at least.
Well, personally, I don't find it surprising to hear you say this. And I'm not sure about our listeners and our viewers and how much they've heard about the effect that sugar has, on the brain, on our systems, how our systems process. And I personally have I feel like really experienced firsthand the impact of sugar. Like I have noticed it. It is noticeable. Now, again, I've got some family history in regards to how sugar is processed and things. So is it more noticeable because maybe there's some precursor there or something? I'm not sure. But it is so obviously different when I am consuming sugar versus when I am not. So obviously different. And it is also so incredibly addicting. And I know research shows us this, that it's incredibly addicting. So it's one of those things where, honestly, it reminds me in myself, I'll speak from first person, it reminds me from what I've heard of people who are in recovery for alcoholism, as an example, where that idea of, I can have a little bit. And then all of a sudden, I can't have a little bit. It's that same thing, like, I have a little bit, but no, I really can't, because then all of a sudden I'm craving it. And it happens so quickly, and it's very, very difficult. And I've also noticed, and I'm kind of curious if you could speak to this aspect of it and what exactly is maybe happening here. But I've noticed that it's like do I have this right? I'm seeking it basically like as a dopamine hit as well throughout the day. Like, is dopamine released, or is there something similar there of like seeking sort of like a little something, almost like a reward, something throughout, again, almost like picking up the phone and looking for an alert, that kind of thing. To me, it seems like there's something similar happening.
Sure. So, again, not to get too nerdy into the science, but kind of the part of our brain that controls this reward system is called the ventral tegmental area. This part of the brain just kind of has little tendrils that go out into all other parts of the brain, including your prefrontal cortex, which is this kind of area where we're supposed to are kind of higher thinking, higher cognitive processes. Interestingly, we used to think that that dopamine was released in response to the stimulus. So thinking of this idea that if I eat sugar, then when I taste the sugar and I get that sweetness on, the molecules bind to my taste buds, that the dopamine gets released. What we've now seen actually in studies is that the dopamine gets released even before you eat the sugar. So it's, are you seeking that behavior? Yes. But is it a 1-to-1 ratio? No, it's kind of more of this conditioning. And I think that's a good thing, at least from the idea of, are we going to fight this good fight against it? Because if what I know is that the sugar itself is not what's rewarding me, then that means I can use something else as a reward, right? So if I don't tie it to this specific molecule, this carbon ring that is sugar, right? Then I can, again, figure out, what is it? What is my positive reinforcement? And again, I know that's often easier said than done. We are hardwired to seek calories, right? Most of our time, we've always had less food rather than excess food. And to be fair, a large part of the world still has, far less food than they need to eat. We're very fortunate in America that we have an excess of calories available. But it makes sense that we're hardwired to, we're hardwired to seek those calories, and sugar is high. It's a high caloric intake, and in a different part of the world, if you were in a resource scarce setting, that drive to consume as much sugar as you could at one time, would be beneficial, right? It's just not when you have, when you've got a gallon of ice cream. That drive then can sometimes be problematic. And so, yes, there is a seeking behavior, but my argument is that because it's a behavior, it can be shaped, it can be changed, and part of that is kind of a lot of it for me is we talk about biohacking, and so I think one of the things that came to mind when you talked about rewarding yourself with a bowl of ice cream for not eating sugar all day, something that actually tends to work really well. And again, with the disclaimer, it's not medical advice, but it's kind of just practical advice. Is something I would talk about called mindful eating. And mindful eating is really kind of, it could be many things, but for me, mindful eating is this kind of slow and deliberate process of really just kind of connecting with your food. I think a lot of times we're detached from our food because we didn't have to go out and catch it or make it, and we popped it in the microwave, or we just went through the drive-through and got it. But take ice cream for example. I would challenge someone to sit down, and if it normally takes you 5 minutes to consume a bowl of ice cream, or that's 2 scoops of ice cream per se. Try this. Try just a scoop of ice cream instead of 2, and make it last for the same amount of time. So you put a bite of ice cream in your mouth and just think about it. Enjoy it. Taste it. Taste the texture. Think about, this is, it's vanilla. It's, I can feel that it's cold. You're kind of, you're acknowledging what's going on in your process. And if you want to really be kind of involved in it, be thankful for it. Be thankful that you've had the provision, that you can afford it. Be thankful that you have your taste buds still intact, because post-COVID, a lot of people don't have their taste buds intact. Be thankful that, you have the ability to walk off the 25 calories there. If you really, really kind of be in the moment and be mindful of the food, I think what you find is that you can enjoy the food, but you can enjoy it more, but enjoy a lesser quantity of it, and find that you come away from the experience with less calories, less of whatever else might be bad in that food that you're eating, and still have kind of fulfilled this, wow, I have this kind of drive. I really like ice cream, because the worst thing for dieting is telling people you can never eat pizza again. You can never eat ice cream again, because, as people, we just don't do good with nevers, right? We don't do good with no, but we do much better with you can, but let's do it in a different way. Let's do it in a way that's healthier. Let's do it in a way that's more mindful, and let's do it in a way that, again, just shows our gratitude for the provisions that we have. I think that's, if I have a really good cousin, and we used to, when we were young, we used to, always talk about that, all the food that you ate before you prayed for it was bad for you. And then, so, it's always better to, if you forgot to pray for your food, to stop in the middle of this idea of sometimes we get so wrapped up in getting this food in us, we even forget to pray over our food. Right. So, just, connecting with your food and realizing it's, it's part of the human experience, and it's part of, even I would argue it's part of communion with our Creator who has provided for us.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is just remembering the goodness kind of all around, and definitely depending on where we're living, where people are tuning in from, and what their status is, of course, as well, socioeconomic and things like that. It can be something that's just kind of taken for granted. And we can forget, to slow down. I know that during a busy workday, eating is just something that like I just have to get done. And it's not actually something to really sit back and enjoy. And that's something I actually started changing a couple of months ago, was scheduling an actual lunch break to really sit down. And I work from home, so I can actually make it. So I actually make something, I actually cut up vegetables and make a salad. And honestly, the rhythm of that it has impacted my mental health. Just the rhythm of every day I chop everything up and I cook up the chicken and then I sit down and don't always have quite enough time to like eat it at the pace I would like. So, there's still room for improvement. And yet I look forward to that in the day. And I don't listen to anything. I listen a lot all day. And so it's just quiet in my house and I enjoy the peacefulness of that. And there is something about that whole process, again, that is more restorative than just, oh, I've got to get this done and maybe I'm listening to something or I got to jump to the next thing. It's like, no, there's something restorative about that pause in the middle of the day and doing something with my hands. Again, maybe if you're someone who does something with your hands all day long, maybe it's like, oh, I don't want to do anything with my hands. But for me, since I don't, there's something also about that, that contrast. I think that also helps to tell my brain, oh, I'm doing something. It's a different time right now. Like I can be in a different place mentally and emotionally right now because I'm doing something different. Again, the tangibility also helps with that. So absolutely, I would encourage everyone to kind of play around with this. Like I hear you, of course, a disclaimer that it's not medical advice. And yet it's sounding like there's something key here about inflammation and us desiring to have minimal amounts of inflammation, that is going to have an impact on how our bodies function, which is going to have an impact, of course, therefore, on our mental health, because our mental health is connected to us physiologically. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And this slowing down part too is beneficial in more ways than one as well. I often will talk about Sarah Ballantyne's research. She's a PhD, and kind of her PhD thesis focused on epithelial transport. But she really talks a lot about preparing your body to eat, right? So slowing down and the enzymes that go on, starting in your mouth all the way down to your gut, is appropriately processing your food and breaking it down to maximize the nutritional content. Again, this the process of having a balanced nutritional diet is really kind of key to helping all of the things that need to work the way they need to do. So all of these processes oftentimes require different vitamins and minerals as cofactors for enzymes in order for things to work the way that they need to do. And food is fuel. And it's interesting that kind of the way you put the fuel in matters. And you definitely can extract more nutrients, and you'll usually feel more satiety when you eat slower. And that, again, generally translates to, less calories. And so, for a lot of people, not everyone, but for a lot of folks that struggle with their weight, caloric excess is, it's the big kind of elephant in the room. And while our bodies will adapt, if you just rapidly cut your calories, your body will adapt and it'll kind of get you a new set point. Slowly lowering your set point by just a few calories here and there is actually the way to do it, and kind of force your body to reset that set point at a slower pace. And so you don't kind of get this rebound that everyone thinks about in the yo-yo diet. So you go on whatever the diet of the day is and you restrict yourself down to 1,200 calories and you're like, great, I'm doing great. I've lost 20 pounds. And then you're like, okay, so I've lost my 20 pounds and now I can maintain it at the old caloric intake. And what you find is that you can't. And sometimes you can't even maintain it at the new caloric intake. So rapidly changing your metabolic set point is not great. And so going back to this, mindful eating, preparing yourself to eat by, again, connecting with your food, allows you to kind of feel fuller sooner. And it activates kind of all these neurotransmitters that we have, hormones, or ghrelin and leptin, and the things that tell us that we're full or that we're hungry. And you activate that, you end up with less calories, but it's not this abrupt shift in calories that often causes people to have this bouncing back and forth.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so kind of like what we were saying at the beginning of this conversation of we're going to make changes slowly. We're not doing everything at once, and we're not even like how I shared with lunches of, oh, I've made this change, but I could still figure out how to extend the time so that I have more time to actually eat and I'm not feeling more rushed at the end to actually consume the food. So again, like we're taking this in steps and we're continuing to make improvements as we're able and as we're recognizing that there are improvements to be made. I really appreciate what you said too at the beginning of how when you meet a trauma survivor, it's common for you to also be meeting someone who is like, gosh, I'm just failing, or I need to get this all right. And I need to, and that makes so much sense to me that that would be a common mindset for someone to have. And so really recognizing that we can have it and recognizing the need for the kindness for the patients. I like to talk about, we are not exempt from a 1 Corinthians 13 love. We get kindness and patience and all of that for ourselves too. And so remembering to also apply that of, okay, like I'm moving forward. And again, what Dr. Robert also mentioned about maybe making some notes about it. So you have some place to reflect if you are losing track of the progress that's being made. I had one other question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, go ahead.
No, yeah. I was just going to say, yeah, absolutely. Keeping track of it is a good idea.
Well, I had one other question that I wanted to ask about nutrition before we touch on exercise. I had some research pointed out to me not that long ago about certain foods possibly assisting in the creation of new neural synapses, which of course would be really, really cool because if our brains are wired in certain ways, new synapses help us to wire them in different ways. So if we're actively trying to change things, have you heard about this? Any thoughts on this kind of research? Can certain foods help us?
Yeah, I remember you mentioned that to me last time, and I had looked it up. I probably still have the study saved somewhere, but the gist of it is that yes, and I'm trying to remember I don't remember particularly what the food was, but I looked at. So, as physicians, when we look at studies, we kind of look at, before we even look at what the study says, we look at, is this a junk study or not, right? Is the power adequate? I.e., was the sample size large enough? Was there a statistically significant outcome? Who funded it? Were there things? And so I remember looking at the study. I almost thought about pulling it back up. And I thought, I can't remember if we talked about that last time, but long and the short of it is, yes, highly recommend Google Scholar, and look it up for anybody who's interested. I apologize for not having it pulled back up, but I do remember reading the study and going, yeah, that was something that yes, there is. There was evidence to support that. And that honestly to me feels kind of like part and parcel of what we know about neural synapses in general, because we know that the adult brain has neuroplasticity. It used to kind of be this old guard idea where, once you were past 22 or 23, you couldn't change, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But that's just, that's not the case, right? And I think, one of the things, and I do think we touched on this during sleep, is this idea that you actually, in order to make new memories, which again is kind of these new dendrites reaching out and touching one another and reinforcing things, you have to kind of clear out the toxins in your brain. And so, at the end of the day, all of what we're talking about with a healthy brain is a brain that is not toxic. It's actually a term that I use quite often when someone comes into the emergency department, and my initial diagnosis is, I don't really know what's causing this. We call it a toxic encephalopathy. So we're just basically saying there's something going on that's toxic in the brain, and we don't know what it is. It may be an electrolyte derangement. It may be that there's been a stroke. There may be the fact that there is some kind of have recently had a patient who had this terrible syndrome called Wernicke-Korsakoff that is secondary to a thiamine deficiency that causes terrible amnesia. But nonetheless, we talk about this, there's this kind of toxic insult to the brain. And so, I would say that anything that is, anti-inflammatory, turmeric or curcumin is kind of always the first thing that comes up to people's mind. But, keeping these inflammatory cytokines down, keeping these free radicals down, all of that is going to allow the normal processes that occur in the brain to occur more efficiently, really. I mean, it's not just about efficiency, but it's kind of also kind of about accuracy, because, you don't just want to propagate synaptic connections. You want to propagate, strong synaptic connections, right? And so when you're learning something, or you're, encoding new memories, you want to encode those in a way that you'll remember them. And so, yes, if we maybe when we're done here, I will pull that study back up and I'll send it to you, and you can addend this at the end, and I'll tell you the one that I looked at.
Happy to. That'd be great. Yeah, I thought it was so interesting. Well, the other thing that I've been hearing more and more about is how good walking is in regards to exercise, which, okay, in another life, it feels like I was a personal trainer for 4 years. That was actually my primary job for a period of time. And I was of that mindset of like, I have to borderline kill myself in order to get the effects of exercise. That's definitely not the case post having a child and hitting 40, I'm on my way to 40, it turned 40 next year. And it's just that's just not where I'm at. I don't have even the brain discipline, the mental discipline anymore to put myself through that. I have, fortunately, through trauma, healing I've done in regards to childhood trauma, have become kinder and gentler with myself. And so I don't really want to do that to me anymore. And so I've been really, really pleased to see more and more about the impact of walking. So again, we're focusing on exercise in regards to mental health specifically. I absolutely, hands down, notice a difference on my mental health when I take a walk at some point during the day. Now, I've heard, and some have said it's got more benefit in the morning versus later or whatever, but I'm curious what you'd have to say about walking or any other form of exercise, just how that can help someone who's healing from trauma.
Sure. So, I mean, lots of positives from exercise. If we kind of get down to if I think about exercise in a reductionist kind of way, again, I think we get back to when I think about health impacts, aside from the fact that, you're oxygenating, getting more oxygen in, you're making your heart stronger, all of these things. One of the immediate things that happens, whether you're walking or doing anything else, really is that as soon as we kind of start using our muscles and start doing things, your body will start kind of putting these, what we call these GLUT4. I think of them as little tunnels. They're really kind of receptors. But the long and the short of it is you start going for a walk, and you've got, maybe you just had your bowl of ice cream, and your blood sugar is now, 150, 160. You start going for a walk, and your cells will start upregulating and putting these little tunnels for that glucose to come inside of your cells and come in and get that out of your blood sugar, so you don't get this kind of pro-inflammatory response that happens when we have high blood sugar. Particularly for somebody who's battling diabetes and you're battling kind of some of the sequela of having constantly high blood sugar, like people who are getting nerve damage, like peripheral neuropathy and those things. You can stop this kind of glycosylation that happens that is what damages the nerves. But even if you're someone who's entirely healthy, you're going to bring down your inflammation by doing this because you're clearing this sugar out of your blood. And, it's a free pass. It's one of the easy ways without kind of cranking out a bunch of extra insulin because, really the process of, we talk about acquired diabetes or type 2 diabetes, or even if we're talking about type 1.5, which is kind of like an in-between, where folks kind of get to the point where their pancreas isn't working well. Generally, diabetes, the kind of acquired diabetes that we think about, happens because of insulin resistance. You've had so much sugar for so long that your pancreas has cranked out so much insulin that your cells are just like, they start becoming resistant to it. And when you have a resistance to insulin, then instead of the glucose coming into the cells where it can be used for cellular processes and to make things that are, appropriate for your body, it just kind of hangs out in the blood and does all kinds of bad things, right? So one of the ways that walking or any other exercise is beneficial is it's a free pass without using your insulin to get the sugar out of your blood, gets it into the cells. So it helps stave off the insulin resistance that is part and parcel of diabetes. Okay, so exercise, moving your body in general, is good for clearing glucose. So that's one. That's kind of the first thing I think about why exercise can be good. Again, we talk about detoxifying the brain just as a loose term.
May I jump in and ask a question on that real quick before you move on?
Yeah.
So, and maybe you're heading here anyway, but does that also mean that it helps mitigate the inflammation that the sugar would have caused? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and not just the inflammation, because we've talked about this. So you have this inflammation that happens, right, due to, again, the things that sugar causes. Certain sugar concentration will cause, this kind of, fatty acid metabolism that then happens then. And again, you've got byproducts. So again, if you think about your body as a factory and you think about sugar as somebody kind of running through the factory, telling everybody it's time to get to work. Well, if everybody starts getting to work at the same time, then you're going to start seeing all the byproducts of all this metabolism coming out, right? And all these byproducts, include all of the, the byproducts that we don't want that causes, again, this inflammation that is usually a response, from the immune system to, us performing biochemical processes faster than we need to be doing so. Yes, so that is part of it. So that's one of the ways that it helps. So another way that it helps stave off the inflammation is this kind of interesting thing that still amazed me that I didn't really know this or didn't really understand it until I was fairly, really. I mean, I guess I was probably in medical school before it really kind of hit me. Was that, we have our circulatory system, and your heart pumps blood around your body, but we also have a lymphatic system, which is an entirely separate network, right? That moves, lymph around our body. Well, what is lymph? Well, it's part and parcel of the immune system. It's all of the good things and bad of your immune system. The things that fight for us. So the white cells and, all of these things, they get sent through the immune system. When you pick up a virus, you'll have an immune cell pick that up and take it to a lymph node, and the lymph node will be like, hey, this doesn't look good. We better send out some soldiers. You'll make some antibodies for that, and they'll go out through the system. Another thing that happens on a regular basis, and when we think about cancer, is that cancer is an uncontrolled cell division, and so we oftentimes, when you're making a new cell, a new blood cell, or a new skin cell, or whatever kind of new cell you're making, sometimes when you make a copy of that blueprint, that DNA, the copy's not 100%, and there's an error. One of the things that our immune system does is it picks up those cells that have errors in them and destroys them. Okay, so one of the reasons why one of the biggest risk factors for cancer is age, is because our immune systems wane as we get older, right? And so it's not that necessarily there's something inherent about age itself that causes you to be more predisposed to cancer. It's that your immune system in general is not as adept as you get older. And so these normal kind of surveillance processes would go on and identify an aberrant cell that would then be destroyed, gets by the defenses. And then that cell goes on to proliferate. Okay. So where does that have to do with exercise? Well, the lymph system, which is a lymphatic system that moves all of these immune cells around our body, doesn't have a built-in pump. The way it moves is with muscle power. So when you do a curl, when you walk, all of these things are basically squeezing these lymphatic vessels in your body, and it's moving these surveillance things around your body so that the immune cells can get to where they need to go. Okay, this is particularly important with returning them to where they're at, because you do still have immune cells in your blood, and they go through this really kind of neat process where there's local inflammation, and the blood cells or the vasculature will kind of open up and allow some of these immune cells out. But when they're recollected and they're returned kind of back into circulation or returned to the lymph nodes so that defenses can be made, a lot of that is done through the lymphatic system, which doesn't have its own pump. So if you don't move your body, you will not move your lymph around. Okay. So exercising, taking a walk, doing curls at the gym, just standing up, right? So I get a notification on my watch every hour. Hey, it's time to stand up, right? Just doing that literally is it's just one big push, and you're pushing those cells around. So you can imagine if those cells don't move around, and then you have an aberrant cell that comes out and your body's doing what it does, right? It's making a new red blood cell. If that red blood cell is, unable to be seen by the sentinels that need to see it, then you can see how that can be problematic. I always bring this study up, and I really should go back and figure out what the name of it was, but they did a really good study back in the day when there were when trolley cars were kind of the main way of getting around in Great Britain, and so it was kind of a controlled environment where you had people who were working in the same environment every day, but with two different jobs. And there were always two folks on the trolley. One was the driver and one was the ticket taker. So one of these people was in the exact same environment, kind of, inside the trolley for 8 hours a day, but they walked up and down the aisles, taking tickets, punching tickets, so on and so forth. The other guy was, driving the trolley or, controlling it. Honestly, I can't remember if I've ever been in a trolley, so I don't really know what that guy up front does, but whatever he does, he's not walking, right? And at the end of the day, what they found was that the health outcomes of the guy who sat all day were far worse than the guy who walked up and down and took tickets all day. And I think one of the inherent arguments in that wasn't just the exercise, but the idea that, I think you could make an argument that this kind of levels of inflammation secondary to the fact that part of the way we get rid of inflammation is by clearing it, right? By letting the immune cells circulate around, because one of the ways we shut off our immune response is when those cells come in, the neutrophils come in and they go, okay, things look okay here. And they actually shut down that inflammatory response. So our immune system, while it is pro-inflammatory, it's also anti-inflammatory. But if you don't get the inspectors to the site, for a simplistic term, then there's no way they can tell that the problem has been cleared.
That's fascinating. That's so interesting.
So, yeah.
No, and I have friends who are massage therapists, and they'll talk about, lymphatic drainage, and I've never known, like, what is that? Okay, sure. And drink more water after. Great. I'll do that. But I don't know what's happening here. That is really, really interesting. Okay. So all of this connects. Can you connect all of this back to are people who are like, okay, looking for healing from trauma, looking for mental health improvement. Can you kind of bring that home for us and bring it together?
Sure. And I think that what we're talking about really is most of the time, I think that folks that are healing from trauma tend to be in this kind of what we call a sympathetic response state. For example, if we take someone who's recently experienced trauma, they just went through a traumatic event, and we measure sympathetic catecholamines, metanephrines in their urine, they're higher than than somebody who hasn't. And so I think of this as a sympathetic, a ramping up of biochemical processes. That doesn't stop usually when the trauma stops. It's kind of part and parcel of the pathophysiology that continues to, permeate their system and their personhood. And that, in the short term, if I'm running from a tiger, is beneficial.
Right.
But once the tiger's gone, being ramped up like that all the time is not good for long term. And we get these long term kind of pro-inflammatory processes that in turn makes it harder for us to have these kind of, appropriate, well-functioning neurocognitive processes, this kind of just electrical and biochemical processes that go on that are part of a healthy brain, that are part of reintegrating back into ourself and our personhood. And when we think about exercise, exercise has several really well-described mechanisms that help mitigate those pro-inflammatory processes and also kind of those pro-sympathetic processes, even though exercise itself is kind of a sympathetic, a stimulating thing. What we know is that you end up getting downregulation of a lot of these kind of, again, this kind of getting ramped up type processes that people who regularly exercise tend to have their kind of homeostasis perturbed less easily. And that is kind of this, again, without sounding too cliche, is kind of being centered. And it's not really just about being centered as there's this thing out in the ether that people are, you go to your therapist and say, I just want you to be more centered. Well, what is that? It's something you can really feel. It's something you can feel with your heart rate. It's something you can feel with your breathing rate. It's something you can feel with this kind of lump in your throat that goes away, and that lump has an actual pathophysiologic cause behind it. And so this kind of centeredness, this is a real thing that, again, when we talk about diet, we talk about exercise, both of those things are positive influences on a very real and describable process of coming back into balance.
It makes me think of just all of the things that go first when we're struggling, whether it's struggling with like just calendar maintenance because there's too much going on, we're overscheduled, or we're struggling again because we're healing from a form of abuse and we are turning towards a lot of things that are very difficult to turn towards and move through. And things like good circadian rhythm stuff, good rest. We talked about that in part 1, as well as the things we've talked about today. Those can be the easiest things to let go. I know that I can feel like just the mental energy to have the self-discipline for good practices in regards to these 3 areas can sometimes just feel like too much. And yet I am so aware that if I let those slide, my capacity actually goes down further, and sometimes drastically so. And therefore they need to be the last things to go. They actually need to be the first things that I give time and attention to. And so I just want to bring us back to that. And, Dr. Rob, I hope it's okay. I can't remember if I'm allowed to call you that or not. If anyone else meets him,
Sure.
Please don't call him that. It's possible he's just being very kind and forgiving with me today, and that I'm not supposed to be calling him this. So any final words for everyone as we wrap up our 2-part episode?
First of all, thank you for, allowing me to have the opportunity to, just come on and talk about some of these things that, unfortunately, in the medical world, insurance doesn't pay us for talking about these things. So when I go to work for my employer, it's, the onus is always on, kind of getting through the appointment, and getting through the appointment doesn't necessarily allow time for talking about these things. So having an opportunity to kind of bring these kind of bigger issues out, where they can be heard and kind of had time to be digested is an amazing opportunity. So thank you for that. But probably my biggest thing is, I keep circling back to this: be kind to yourself. This, kind of the biggest pitfall I see is this catastrophizing, this kind of, I call it the Davidian black and white thinking, where, well, I failed this one thing today, so my entire diet is shot. I didn't make it to the gym today, so my whole exercise program is shot. I'm a failure. I can't keep this up. It's only been 2 days, and look, it's the second day and I haven't even made it to the gym. That's okay, because if you made it yesterday, that's great. If you didn't make it on the first 2 days, but you thought about going, that's great, because that's more than what you did the day before, thinking about going. I have patients that, we talk about quitting smoking, right? And for me, progress is they say, I'm not quitting today, but I thought about it. I thought about quitting today. Still don't want to do it, but I thought about it. That's progress, right? So just kind of, I know there's this tendency to say, everything's a participation award. Well, it's okay in this process, right? You can give yourself a participation award for this, right? Because it's a long journey. And, in parting words, just be kind to yourself, keep track of your progress. And it's certainly okay to, if you want to, humbly bring it up to a friend, or even just in your prayer, God will listen. If you want to tell him, he'll be glad to listen to you telling him about your small achievements that you made for the day. And I think that's okay to talk about, and really just encourage yourself to say, hey, I did okay today. We'll see what tomorrow brings.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for having 2 of these conversations with me. And I truly believe that there's so much here that someone can pull from. So if you have listened to this, if you watch this episode, and if you're like, gosh, yeah, this was helpful, please like it, please follow along, please share, please give us a review, make a comment, all of those good things. It just helps other people to be able to find us and hear more of conversations like this. So again, thank you so much. I will see you all soon.
Thank you.